I said on Sunday that I was not going to get bogged down in the weeds or miss the forest for the trees. And I said that knowing that I was about to go through a chapter and a few verses at the beginning of chapter 6, Genesis 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, that have been of interest to me since I was a child. Lots of questions come up out of those verses. You have this genealogy where people are living these extraordinarily long lives, ranging from 777 years to 969 years. A bit of Bible trivia later that I'm sure you'll fly through, because Bible trivia questions are made out of this passage. And I've also noticed this week lots of commentary of people who know that these passages aren't integral to our central faith claims, but they're just so interesting. Then you, at the beginning of chapter 6, you have these 4 verses about these sons of God, these demigod type characters called Nephilim, impregnating the daughters of humanity, and then it just goes right on to the next part. And that's given as the reason why people don't live past 120 years. And I remember reading that as a child, aware that there were people alive in the world that at that time in my childhood that were in their early 120s. You know, they get celebrated on the ABC Nightly News or whatever, Dateline. And I was like, whoa, is the Bible wrong about that? And these things would trouble me. And so what I thought I was going to do today was go over a Mesopotamian flood story that was older than the biblical flood story, but helps us understand where the Hebrew writers are coming from and what they're doing. Very similar to what the creation accounts were doing, where you had these older creation accounts and the Hebrew writers subvert these old stories to turn a myth that was meant to defend hierarchies that were unbalanced and to defend domination by divine right. Well, you see a similar thing in the Noah flood story, and you only get that if you are aware of, I'm going to pick the best known one, the Gilgamesh epic, to go over with you. But what I thought I was going to do is do Gilgamesh and then move right into Noah today and then finish up Noah next week. I couldn't get through chapter 5 without finding enough interesting things that I wanted to talk about today. And so you'll have to let me know if it gets too dense and too boring, and I'll try to keep that in mind as we go forward. So first, I'm going to share my screen and bring up my presentation. And we're not going to read the genealogies together because, well, you know. But I'm going to trust that you had read them. We'll be going over Genesis 5 through 6, chapter 4. And let's start, and I wrote genealogies, Nephilim, and flood myths. And here's a picture from the Gilgamesh flood epic. So, in my Common English Bible commentary, a man by the last name of Hiebert writes, "The interest in genealogies springs from the belief that one's ancestry and heritage determine one's identity. This is the priest's record of the generations before the flood." That would be in contrast with the genealogy that we read last Bible lesson that I mentioned in the sermon this past Sunday, where the genealogy of Cain is listed. That's the Yahweh's genealogy line. While the genealogy in 5, 1 through 32 shares some of the names of the Yahweh's genealogy that precedes it, like Enoch and Lamech, familiar names in both lists, it also has unique features. Most obviously, it tells readers how long figures lived. It also traces Adam's lineage through Seth instead of through Cain. It also contains different names in a different order. Furthermore, it includes 10 generations instead of 7. More on that in a second. Remember, 10 generations. Genealogies, I'm writing this, genealogies connect hearers of these stories to the players in the stories, re-emphasizing the point that their stories are our stories. And that's a common motif at this point. And you'll see it going forward as well, how the genealogies bring an old story into the presence of the readers. And as we also trace our own connection to these heroes of the faith in books like Hebrew in the Christian scriptures, you see a not exactly modern, still 2,000 years old, but you see Christians in the early centuries of the church doing a similar thing to bring those old stories into the present. And in some way, the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and all of these people is related to our outlook and how we live our lives and what is called from us today. And this genealogy fills a similar function. Let me go. So you see a picture of it in comparisons. I will note one other interesting similarity between these two, and I just kind of wonder at it. I don't really have an answer, is you have Lamech mentioned in both lists. And the Lamech in the account in Genesis 5 doesn't have all the baggage that comes with Lamech in the account in Genesis 4, where he gloats at having killed somebody who struck him. But their fathers in both lists are very similar. In the chapter 5 version that we're going over today, it's Methuselah. And in the chapter 4 version, it's Methushael. Linguistically very similar. Don't know what to make of that. Maybe nothing should be made of it. I just thought it was interesting. As we were saying, you will notice that these people are said to have lived a very long time. I would say an impossibly long time. There has been much speculation about this. Some have even used this genealogy to date the earth, but when that's done, it often flies in the face of even dating the earth by the rings in the trees that are still living today, and other pieces of archaeological evidence. In truth, and this is that fellow Hebert from the Common English Bible Commentary again, the long lifespans of these pre-flood individuals appears to stem from an ancient Near Eastern belief that people before the flood long outlived their descendants after the flood. This is something I learned this week, which is one of the reasons why I decided to spend more time on it, that these long genealogies aren't only in the Hebrew Bible, but actually the Mesopotamian genealogies and other myths and stories have similar long lists. And in the next quote, we will find that those lists often are grouped in groups of 10. But in the Mesopotamian traditions, they tend to live even longer than the list we find here in the book of Genesis. So quoting Freetham from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, Mesopotamian traditions also feature 10 or so generations before the flood. In a similar list, 8 to 10 kings live a total of 432,000 years in one version, if you combine the whole lifespans, and 421,200 in another. The kings in post-flood lists have much shorter reigns, just like we find in the post-flood story in the Hebrew Bible. And so 2 points I want to make. 1 point and then a segue into the next slide, is that these lists with these really long-lived lives are commonplace in the ancient Near East, and they always are put before flood narratives, and then after flood narratives, you have much more truncated lives. But in the Mesopotamian stories, the people in these lists live thousands and thousands of years. I don't know if you can read the little cheesy comic that I put in there, but the caption to the picture is, 869 years isn't old, Methuselah. You're good for another 100 years. Yeah. Freinlein writes, and I just took a picture of this because I was tired of typing quotes, readers often puzzle over the long lives of these patriarchs. While they might be idealizations of the world's early history, the overall concern for chronology suggests that they are meant to be taken literally. In other words, the original readers really believed that these people lived this long. The decrease in lifespan as time goes along constitutes a notable feature of the ages of these and other ancestral figures. Adam to Noah, 669 to 777, Noah to Abraham, 600 to 200. Israel, 100 to 200. And then in the Psalm, the 10th Psalm, verse 10, it mentions offhand that humans tend to live 70 years. The author may use these statistics to chart the effects of sin upon human life, though diminishing lifespans are also characteristic of Mesopotamian lists. Most basically, these ages are consonant with other features of chapters 1 through 11 that indicate that this age before the flood we're talking about, differs from later ages. Indeed, it belongs to an irretrievable past. In fact, the ages of these individuals lies completely beyond our experience, if not our desires. So this Freinlein is making the case that maybe we could see in the long lives lived and then the increasingly shorter lives lived after the flood, a diminishing of the life that was our original gift from God in Eden, and then everything that followed after. It's one way of looking at it. But I found this what's going to be shared in this next slide, very compelling because it fits a pattern that we've been talking about, where the Hebrew writers take stories that are part and parcel with the cultures around them and subvert them in the context of being a marginalized and occupied and oppressed people. Freinlein writes, major differences from the biblical lists include the names, semi-divine kings, they're semi-divine kings in the Mesopotamian genealogies, versus human beings, which is what we find in the Hebrew scriptures. A motif of democratization comparable to the image of God, shorter lifespans, and if you compare the shorter lifespans in the Hebrew Bible with the Mesopotamian myths, the ratio is 5 years to 1 week ratio. So the Mesopotamian semi-divine kings live 5 years to every 1 week of the ones that we read here in the Hebrew Bible. The biblical list participates in a common folklore about the ages of early humans. The ages were probably understood literally. The ancient texts do not agree about the years involved. So in the Hebrew text, the earliest Hebrew text, the total time span is 1,656. In the Samaritan text, it's shorter, 1,307. And in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it's 2,242. But the big picture, and this is my writing here, I think we have, and this is my opinion, this is not a scholarly consensus, although it's commonly held, that we have here in these genealogies another example of Hebrew storytellers subverting Mesopotamian myths that reinforce unbalanced and unfair hierarchies. So in the Mesopotamian genealogies, you have these semi-divine kings, and that's why they live thousands and thousands of years, because they're very much like gods. And then being like gods gives them the divine sanction to subjugate the peoples as servants, as people who cultivate the land and bring the grain into the temple and into the major city, people who go out to war at behest of the king. That's the kind of semi-divine figures you have in the Mesopotamian lists. And then in the Hebrew Bible, you have people. They may live longer, but they are people like you and me. And in Genesis, a common theme is humans made in the image of God. This is bringing who in the Mesopotamian stories are basically godlike, or somewhere between humanity and godlike, and bringing them back down and saying, no, they may have lived longer at one time, but they're just like you and me. They are humans made in God's image. And so it's a way of taking the storytelling of the cultures around them and subverting it as a way of reclaiming the humanity that should be common to all persons. Again, that's my opinion, but it's a fairly commonly held opinion. But we can't really know for certain. That's the truth as to what the significance was really for these long-lived persons in these genealogies. Another fun, sort of cheesy joke here, or sort of very cheesy joke. In 900 years, there's been lots of joy and lots of sorrow. I've had 32 wonderful wives and 14 terrible ones, says the comic. So Bible trivia time, and I've left you all unmuted so that you can give an answer. Which persons in the Bible are said not to have died?
Enoch.
Yep. Enoch, and there's one other.
So you've got the answer right there.
Oh, Elijah?
Yeah, I could challenge you not to cheat, but yeah, Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire, right in front of his servant Elisha. And this fits a pattern that we see in the Bible where certain persons, and here next week we'll especially focus on Noah and of course Abraham, are given, it's not so much they achieve, it's hard to know how it happens, but they have a special status as it relates to God. And so Enoch is said to have walked with God, which I guess means is in sync with God, on the path with God, valuing God's values, and walking through life in sync with God's purposes. Is said to have walked with God for 300 years. And then he's the shortest lived person, consequently, in the genealogy. He lives 365 years, which I think has to catch our attention because that fits with a year, 365 days. It's a very symmetrical number as it relates to the patterns of the natural world. 365, 1 year. It's also to say that Enoch has lived a very well-rounded and balanced life. And because of this, he does not die. He is just taken. He's just taken. Which leads to the next question. Which persons in the Bible are said to have walked with God? And of course, I've got the answers in front of you. But if you could bear not to look and venture a guess. Of course, you all have already peeked, I can tell.
Yeah, so, we did. Yeah. We peeked.
So you have Enoch, as was mentioned. It's mentioned twice that he walked with God. You have Noah, which is coming right up. And then you have Abraham, who isn't described as having walked with God, but actually in Genesis chapter 17 is invited to walk along with God. Yahweh comes and says, walk with me, in so many words. And then the rest of Abraham's life is an attempt to do just that. And I think that that's why so many of us resonate with the story of Abraham, called from a place that his home to a place that he did not know, in an attempt to walk with God, sometimes pulling it off and sometimes falling into troubles along the way. But Enoch walks with God and is taken up. And biblical scholars believe that we see a foreshadowing of what is about to happen, where you have Noah, the very next person who is claimed to have, who is named as having walked with God, who is taken in another form of intervention into the ark for his salvation and the salvation of his family. And of course, this next one is just kind of, why even ask it? According to the Bible, who is said to have been the longest lived person in history? I even wrote the word duh, Methuselah, coming in hot at 969 years. I remember reading this list as a child and just finding so many questions that no one was really wanting to engage, because it's, well, more on walked with God. Freinlein writes, twice he, Enoch, is said to have walked with God, which testifies to a close relationship with God in the midst of a fallen world. That God took this one who walked with God anticipates God saving Noah into the ark, a special act of divine deliverance. And I've already said these things, I suppose. His living 365 years. We can also find a parallel in the flood narrative, because if you read it carefully, there are two flood narratives that really don't conflict with one another in any serious way. And the writers, what they call the redactors, the ones who compiled the Torah in the final form, cleverly wove the Yahwist version and the priestly version together into a more or less seamless narrative. But you can find differences you can find strains of each story speaking for itself. And in one instance, you have it raining for 40 days and 40 nights. And in the other story we'll get to next week, right alongside that one, the waters rise for 150 days. And then it takes a whole nother half a year for them to recede. So you could see a parallel between Enoch's living a year and later later in the flood story how Noah endures for a year on the water, but that's only speculative. It's fun to find these connections, but sometimes they may not be of any significance, although it makes one wonder. And as I said, it could also refer to a complete or fulfilled life as well, his living 365 years. So this next part is very intriguing. It's a very odd story, and it's very short. And I am going to read this for you. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. When it reads, when the people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. And these 4 verses have garnered more than their fair share of attention and their fair share of representation in artwork. As a matter of fact, in the most recent Hollywood Noah movie, the Nephilim make an appearance as well, or actually this idea of them being Nephilim is also blurred with some apocryphal writings where there are these watchmen who are a part of the Noah story as well. But every drawing that I have in these slides or picture comes from artwork that is directly related to these 4 verses, and so they have caught the attention of generations and generations of biblical scholars and readers. Frein writes, this brief segment is one of the most difficult in Genesis, both to translate and interpret. Certain words are rare or unknown, like this God not being able to abide or contend with, which is in verse 3. And this word Nephilim itself, which is in verse 4, and only in one other verse in the Bible. Issues of coherence arise at many points. These verses may be a fragment of what was once a longer story, or scribes may have added to or subtracted from the text. We'll go back through it. Because one of the common interpretations is to see what transpires here as some form of evil act, and the punishment of this evil act being the shortening of the lives of humans, which I don't think is actually an accurate reading. So we'll go through it carefully. When people begin to multiply, as well they should, I might add. Go see Genesis 1:28. They're supposed to be doing that. On the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, which is an allusion to a divine pantheon, as we've been talking about. You may look at Genesis 1:26 when God said, let us make humanity in our own image. The sons of God saw that they were fair, the daughters of humanity, and they took. Same pattern that we see back in Genesis 3. Eve saw the fruit, saw that it was fair, and took it. Same words. Wives for themselves of all that they chose. But it's not humanity doing this. These are divine figures doing this. Then the Lord, Yahweh's material, so it's a key, the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh's material, I note, often has the divide between the divine and the mortals as a concern, and keep making sure that the bridge between the two is not spanned in a wrong way. So, of course, in Eden, you have humans obtaining knowledge of good and evil and wisdom, but not in life immortal. They are barred from the tree of life. That's the line. And in Babel, you have people building a tower to the heavens in hopes to geographically reach that space, and that is not permissible. This seems to be a story in line with those kinds of stories. And Yahweh says, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120. So in Eden, humanity was cut off from immortality, but wisdom and knowledge of good and evil was gained. At Babel, humanity was scattered so that they could not reach the heavens. And here, it's as if to suggest that the longevity of their life is still too close to immortality for Yahweh's comfort. And so their years are curtailed at 120. And then, of course, Moses comes up in the next chapter, lives far beyond that, I might add. But the Nephilim. The only other time that Nephilim is mentioned in the Bible is in Numbers 13, verse 33. And that's the passage where Joshua sends spies into the promised land to scope it out. And they come back afraid because they see giants there. And then as an aside, it names these giants as the Nephilim, the giants who used to walk the earth. So that's the only other time. It's a mysterious word. We're not exactly sure for certain of its origins. But the story concludes, the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So some questions that I would like to throw into this digital space. Are there bad guys or good guys in this story?
God doesn't say it's bad. He just wants to limit.
Correct. And in this last verse, if anyone is the protagonist or the ones doing something to someone to bring about an intervention from God, it's the Nephilim, right? So why punish the humans? If it is to be seen as a punishment, why punish the humans for something that was done to them? You must see the daughters of humanity here as sort of hapless. Well, are they victims? We don't really know how they feel about this. We don't know. I chose this picture to your right for this slide on purpose. This is called The Fall of the Rebel Angels by Hieronymus Bosch. And it's based on this passage. And you can see here clearly, by way of art, judgment, a judgment on this text, where you've got the Nephilim looking very ominous and coming down into the earth that seems like a very desolate and dark place. And in the Midrashic tradition that would follow, commentaries on this, the Nephilim would sometimes, it would be backread into this story, this idea that these were some of the fallen ones, that their descent to the earth was a descent from heaven into evil and to dark places. But you wouldn't get that from this story. And this story far predates the commentary that would backread nefarious intent onto the story, which is one of the real questions of the story. Why? Why is this story? What is the purpose of this story? How does it inform or not inform our faith? And I really don't have any clear answers to that. And
So trying to answer your question, are there bad guys or good guys? This statement in verse 4, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Are they talking about the children who were born, or are they talking about the Nephilim? What does that refer to?
I think they are talking about the children that were born. And
Okay.
the only reason I think that, which we can't know for certain, is by the way that it is used in the book of Numbers.
Okay.
Because those are clearly just giants. They're giants. And then in commentaries that would be written about the Torah in years later, they would wonder if maybe Goliath, that we read about in First Samuel, or the story of Goliath's brother and other giants, if these giants were the children of this that the story alludes to, but we really can't know.
Okay.
And then the next question, I guess I sort of let the cat out of the bag. Are the actions in this story described as sinful?
I don't think they're described as sinful so much. What bothered me was that they saw that they were beautiful and they married the ones they chose, it was more like it wasn't mutual. It was like just like, I'm taking.
Yes. And unfortunately, one of the more common words to describe the way a husband took a wife is exactly this verbiage. He took her. That is a Hebrew way of describing what becomes a marriage. Not just a Hebrew, I should specify, because that could come off very, an ancient Near East way. Women really were not, did not have much say, which is what makes the story of Ruth later very remarkable, because you have a woman who takes an initiative and pursues a man to her advantage. He's a rich landowner with lots of land, but that is only an astonishing story to the ancient reader because of its uniqueness. And so these Nephilim are behaving as you would expect, I guess, patriarchs, broadly speaking, to behave. And that's lamentable, but that is what that was the cultural practices of the day. But I do see, I like the similarities, and in the order of Saul, took Saul, that they were fair, and then took as just sort of this, instead of humanity reaching for the divine, you have the divine reaching for what is fair and beautiful in humanity. I think that may be an intentional linguistic play on words, but again, we can't know for certain, because this text is just so odd, especially in its placement. And then you may notice in verse 3 that it seems like that's almost a break in the story. And if you go back, you could read, they took for the wives all that they chose. Skip verse 3 and say, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days. And then you could leave it out. It's just a Yahwehist. Scholars can't, they believe verse 3 is for sure from the Yahwehist camp. But the rest of it could read priestly or Elohist. It doesn't use Lord God, it uses God. But it's hard telling. There's not a lot to work here. But verse 3 seems to clearly be Yahwehist, and it seems to only be inserted to put another barrier between maybe not the word I want, distinction between divine and humanity. And this would have been read in the context of humans trying to understand why are there these differences, and why are the days of humanity so often cut short. And this would be just one part of that answer, that God felt it necessary to put another limit, as would later happen as at the Tower of Babel, another kind of interference as humans are trying to grasp towards the divine.
Keith, I do see that if you go on with verse 5, and the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, then I don't know that they go together. Let me say that first. But if they did go together, then it might be assumed that it brought about the wickedness.
Yeah, and that's what I think the picture I selected here points towards, and many have done. The verses that come next, as we'll get into next week, are the precursor for the flood narrative. The specific ones that you're reading. Let me open my Bible here. That's the Yahwehist, the beginning that says the Lord saw the humanity become thoroughly evil, and is about to proclaim the intentions to flood them out. And so it can be read as a response to what happens quite before. It would have to be just, there's really no structural link except for its placement here. Like there's no therefore the Lord did these things.
Right.
Oftentimes when there's supposed to be a segue, therefore the Lord. But people, you're not the first to have thought that or to wondered about that, and it's plausible.
I'll just make a comment on the 120 years. I guess I had forgotten this verse. I had always been told that the reason we went from hundreds of years of living was that when the flood came, or until the flood came, the earth was totally watered from springs underneath. And that the firmament that's talked about earlier was a separation between the earth and heaven. But when the flood came, the firmament gave up the water and thus opened us to the heavens, thus creating the sun having a greater influence on the earth, causing people to die earlier. Have you heard that?
I have heard things like that, and I think I've heard that in specific. You might go back to earlier lessons where I showed like what the ancient understanding in the Near East was of what the planet was like, where you had a disk that we lived on in this dome that separated the heavens, and the water would come down from the dome, or initially in the Yahwist tech readings, it comes up from the earth. It comes from people trying to reconcile stories like this and like the flood with the geological history of the earth. And the geological history, which is, in the realm of science, what they're discovering by observing the stones and the rocks and the rings in the trees. And it does not suggest that there was ever a global flood. The only reason why there's compelling evidence that there was at least been major floods is that these flood stories are across culture. They're in North America, they're in South America. Every ancient people seems to have had a flood story like this. But I take them, and what they're trying to teach us about humanity is the primary takeaway. And so I personally don't really pay much interest in interpretations that are trying to reconcile stories like this with the geographical history of Earth. I think that we often spend a lot of energy doing that and perhaps miss the point. It's all inference, it's all back reading, and I'm not telling you not to pursue that route, because I know that many people they think of it differently than I do, and that becomes a plausible explanation from their vantage point how they approach the text. I think it's what I was saying earlier. Everyone seemed to have these genealogies where people lived very long lives, as if to suggest that before the flood they were living, well, to your point, in a different era, at a different epoch that is now removed from us, and that things have changed. But beyond that, I'm not sure what more we could really infer from it. I don't know if that answers your question or anything.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, but I have heard that there's all sorts of different, especially when we get into the flood stories. I mean, it's kind of, if you take if you're like, say you were at my Christian college that I went to, where we would talk about different theories, and one of the theories was that the flood accounted for the geographical changes that we see across the globe. The professor would often mention it really just to, I think, bring some of the students in the classroom along that were coming at it from perhaps a much more literalist perspective. And then we would move on into lots of the other things that I'm talking about now.
Okay. I guess when we went to go visit the Ark, I guess they showed where they had gone down into the earth, and they could prove by the way that the dirt and everything was different that there had been a flood at one time. But I thought I heard you say that there were just minor floods.
Yeah, there is a ring in the Earth's layering that implies that the Earth was struck by an asteroid. There is a there is an element that is very rare on Earth that is found is in high volume in lots of the asteroids that strike the moon and strike the Earth. And they have found a thick layer of this element that spans the globe that corresponds with the annihilation of millions of species of life forms way back when. You'll find fossils before this ring, but none after. That's the only kind of dividing line I can think of in the geography, but I've never, I'm not aware of Earth scientists that found evidence for a global flood. But you know, the answers in Genesis, folk that run that Ark exhibit, that is what they think.
So I have a question about the Nephilim. Is there any belief that they're still hanging around? I mean, is that part of anybody's theology, philosophy at this point? Because it's in the news even today, if you're aware of some of the crazy coronavirus stuff that's going on.
No, it's a word that people latch on to. There's even a punk rock song by a kind of an anarchist punk band that I knew when I was in high school called "In the Age of the Nephilim," right? And it was completely removed from this text, but it was a word that had captured the imagination of those punk rockers. And I know exactly what you're talking about. I looked up that doctor as soon as I saw that video, and she believes that alien DNA has, like, there's all kinds of things.
Right.
So I think any story, and you know, as vague as the story is, it leaves more room for these outgrowths of speculation. This is 4 verses. It's very short.
So that's not contained in any modern Christian kind of doctrine that you're aware of?
Doctrine, no.
Okay.
Commentary and stories that would follow, yes.
Okay.
The story on the right, as I said, I picked very much on purpose to show how over time, this would be like in medieval Christianity, one of the traditions that developed out of it was that this story that we just read is just one chapter in the descent, the fall of angelic beings from the heavenly realms and into hell. But that's not in this story, but that is what's back read into the story alongside other stories that are told in the centuries that would follow.
My footnote on them says, but in God's eyes, they were sinners.
Right.
Parentheses, fallen ones, ripe for judgment. And so if that's the case, perhaps they were just removed.
Well, the word Nephilim is another one of those words that we don't really have anywhere else. And so the most common rendering, common meaning both places here and in the book of Numbers, it's translated as giants. It just seems to imply very tall, strong, giant, humanoid type persons. Fallen, even in the King James Bible, it was rendered in that way. Some have found, and I haven't looked much into this, but some have found a linguistic link between the word Nephilim and fallen ones, and that's where that comes into play. I think it's a stretch, but I have heard that is a connection people are wanting to make. This is a good case in point of how our stories about these stories take on lives of their own, which I think is very natural when it comes to religious stories. And that's one of the reasons why I emphasize the midrash as a tradition that we can pay attention to. And that's that the learnings of the conversation with these stories can lead us to wisdom and knowledge of God in and of themselves. But see, this is a whole can of worms. I'm glad I went down this route. How are you feeling is this interesting to everyone else, or is it just me?
No, it is. It is.
Interesting.
Have we gotten to the last question yet?
Yeah. Why should humanity pay the price for the actions of the sons of God?
I'm not sure we pay the price for the actions of the sons of God. We pay the price for the actions of Adam and Eve.
I guess the question comes from the way that this story is set up, where in verse 3, it seems to be that as a result of this encounter with the Nephilim, that the years of humanity are reduced.
Oh, you mean why should we not live as long?
Yeah.
Really? Do you want to live longer?
It depends on what kind of life we're talking about, I guess.
Yeah.
If I'm at 90, every bit as physically every bit as fit as you'd expect a 90-year-old to be, and everything after that was a descent into further health complications and pains, and then no, I would not want to live that long. But if I feel basically the same at 250 as I did at 40, maybe, I don't know. Depends on how bored you get, I guess. Well, we're going to move on. And this is what time is it? So I want to keep track because we have time for this. Because June has her doctor's appointment at 3:45.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems, you know what, we already went all over this. So I'm not going to go through it again. This is another piece of artwork out of the Kelly wondered if I should put that in there because it's sort of maybe a bit
risque.
Risque, yeah.
No,
but it's inspired by this story as well. So Noah is next week now. It's been pushed back. But first, I would like to quote this, and then we're going to go through the Gilgamesh epic. We're going to read it. It's only 6.5 minutes long to read. I timed it yesterday, so it's not super long. Then we're going to talk about the similarities. And we're going to stop there, because next week we're going to talk about the important differences in keeping with this theme of the Hebrew writers subverting the stories of their oppressors. The Noah's flood narrative is a great example of that will preach and then some. But we're not going to get to that this week. We're going to just notice the similarities between the two. So Hybert, in the Common English Bible Commentary, writes, Israel shared with its neighbors the idea that history was divided into two ages. The first age ended with a great flood. Both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic from Mesopotamia describe such a flood. They have many parallels to the biblical story. One key difference is that the Atrahasis epic explains the flood as the God's judgment to control overpopulation, while Genesis describes it as God's judgment of human sin. All of these flood stories appear to give expression to the deep human uneasiness about the stability of order in the world and the constant threat of chaos. In the biblical world, uncontrolled floodwaters were the primary symbol of chaos. That's an important point to remember for other passages going forward. Whenever waters and floods and storms, think the book of Job, it's a symbol of chaos. And people in the Near East and in this area were not really sailors. It's another point of the Jonah story. And the storm in that is it's chaos and God's ability to control chaos. And one of the most powerful images in the Christian scriptures is in the book of Revelation, where you have a glassy sea, not meant to be seen as a sea made of glass, but a sea that is in front of the throne of God, that is held in complete calm because God is sovereign and in control of even the chaos. So it's a recurring theme. So the Gilgamesh epic, which comes from between 2150 to 1400 BCE, that is a wide time span because the one that we're about to read is the most common version of it, but it went through several iterations in edits, and we know this by scraps of tablets and portions of the story that are found, but it was composed and tweaked in this very large span of time. We'll get to that next. So I'm going to pull away from that screen and Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the flood section of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a longer narrative about, well, you will see. Today, the hero's story, the Noah character, his name is Utnapishtim. It reads, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh a secret story that begins in the old city of Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates River. The great gods Anu, Enlil, Nitirta, Enuji, and Ea were sworn to secrecy about their plan to cause the flood. But the god Ea, Sumerian god Enki, repeated the plan to Utnapishtim through a reed wall in a reed house. Ea commanded Utnapishtim to demolish his house and to build a boat, regardless of the cost, to keep living beings inside. The boat must have equal dimensions, with corresponding width and length, and be covered over like Apsu boats. Utnapishtim promised to do what Ea commanded. He asked Ea what he should say to the city elders and the population. Ea tells him to say that Enlil has rejected him, and he can no longer reside in the city or set foot in Enlil's territory. He should say also that he will go down to the Apsu to live with my lord Ea. Note, Apsu can refer to a freshwater marsh near the temple of Ea Enki at the city of Eridu. Building and launching the boat. Carpenters, reed workers, and other people assembled one morning. These next lines are missing. 5 days later, Utnapishtim laid out the exterior walls of the boat 120 cubits. The sides of the superstructure had equal lengths of 120 cubits. He also made a drawing of the interior structure. The boat had 6 decks, divided into 7 and 9 compartments. Water plugs were driven into the middle part. Punting poles and other necessary things were laid in. 3 times 360 units of raw bitumen were melted in a kiln, and 3 times 3,600 units of oil were used in addition to 2 times 3,600 units of oil that were stored in the boat. Oxen and sheep were slaughtered, and ale, beer, oil, and wine were distributed to the workmen like at a New Year's festival. When the boat was finished, the launch was very difficult. A runway of poles was used to slide the boat into the water. 2/3 of the boat was in the water. Utnapishtim loaded his silver and gold into the boat. He loaded all the living things that I had. His relatives and craftsmen and all the beasts and animals of the field boarded the boat. The time arrived, as stated by the god Shamash, to seal the entry door. The storm. Early in the morning, at dawn, a black cloud arose from the horizon. The weather was frightful. Utnapishtim boarded the boat and entrusted the boat and its contents to his boatmaster, Puzuramuri, there's a name for you, who sealed the entry. The thunder god, Adad, rumbled in the cloud, and storm gods, Shular and Hanish, went over mountains and land. Aragal pulled out the mooring poles, and the dikes overflowed. The Anunnaki gods lit up the land with their lightning. There was stunned shock at Adad's deeds, which turned everything to blackness. The land was shattered like a pot. All day long, the south wind blew rapidly, and the water overwhelmed the people like an attack. No one could see his fellows. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. The gods were frightened by the flood and retreated up to the Anu heaven. They cowered like dogs lying out by the outer wall. Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. The mistress of the gods wailed that the old days had turned to clay because I said evil things in the assembly of the gods, ordering a catastrophe to destroy my people who fill the sea like fish. The other gods were weeping with her and sat sobbing with grief, their lips burning, parched with thirst. The flood and wind lasted 6 days and 6 nights, flattening the land. On the 7th day, the storm was pounding, intermittently, like a woman in labor, calm after the storm. The sea calmed and the whirlwind and flood stopped. All day long there was quiet. All humans had turned to clay, that is, they died. The terrain was as flat as a rooftop. Utnapishtim opened a window and felt fresh air on his face. He fell to his knees and sat weeping, tears streaming down his face. He looked for coastlines at the horizon and saw a region of land. The boat lodged firmly on Mount Nimush, which held the boat for several days, allowing no swaying. On the seventh day, he released a dove that flew away, but came back to him. He released a swallow, but it also came back to him. He released a raven, which was able to eat and scratch, and did not circle back to the boat. He then sent his livestock out in various directions. The sacrifice. He sacrificed a sheep and offered incense at a mountainous ziggurat, where he placed sacrificial vessels and poured reeds, cedar, and myrtle into the fire. The gods smelled the sweet odor of the sacrificial animal and gathered like flies over the sacrifice. When the great goddess arrived, lifted up her beads, flies, it's a funny word, they said, "Ye gods, as surely as I shall not forget this lapis lazuli around my neck, I shall be mindful of these days and never forget them. The gods may come to the sacrificial offering, but Enlil may not come, because he brought the flood and annihilated my people without considering the consequences." When Enlil arrived, he saw the boat and became furious at the Igigi gods. He said, "Where did a living being escape? No man was to survive the annihilation." Ninurta spoke to Enlil, saying, "Who else but Ea could do such a thing? It is Ea who knew all of our plans." Ea spoke to Enlil, saying, "It was you, the sage of gods. How could you bring about a flood without consideration?" Ea then accuses Enlil of sending a disproportionate punishment and reminds him of the need for compassion. Ea denies leaking God's secret plan to Atrahasis, or another name, I guess, for Utnapishtim, admitting only sending him a dream and deflecting Enlil's attention to the flood hero. Enlil then boards a boat and, grasping Utnapishtim's hand, helps him and his wife aboard where they kneel. Standing between Utnapishtim and his wife, he touches their foreheads and blesses them. Formerly, Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife have become gods like us. Let Utnapishtim reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. Utnapishtim and his wife were transported and settled at the mouth of the rivers. So I read that to highlight the two things. One, this comes before our Genesis accounts of the flood. This predates it. And the parallels, while the writing styles are very different, in some ways the cosmology is different, or lots of ways the cosmology is different, there's the similarities are quite striking. Next week, we will be going over the differences that really do matter and what some of the powerful messages are about God and God's love for us. But first, the similarities. Extent of the flood, global in both cases. The cause, humanity's sins or humanity's wickedness in both cases. Intended for whom? In Gilgamesh, the city specifically, but then by extension all humanity. Genesis, all humanity. The sender of the flood was the assembly of the gods, and one named out Enlil in particular as being the driver of this. And in Genesis, it's Yahweh or Elohim, both, depending on which narrative strand we're reading. Name of the hero, Utnapishtim, Noah in the Genesis account. The character of the hero, in both cases, righteous. Gilgamesh receives it in a dream. Noah, direct from God. They're both ordered to build a boat. They both complain about it. The height of the boat, they're both very cube-like. You notice in the Gilgamesh, it's perfectly square, and in the Bible, it's rectangular, but they're both covered in pitch. There's one window at least. There's one door. There's compartments. There's several stories high, 3 in Genesis, seems to be 6 in Gilgamesh. They bring family members, but in Gilgamesh, a few other passengers, some people who seem to be the builders of the boat. They bring all species of animals. The means of the flood in Gilgamesh is a heavy rain. In Genesis, it's groundwater in the Yahwist account and heavy rain for 40 days and 40 nights in the priestly account. The duration of the flood, 6 days and 6 nights in Gilgamesh, 40 days and 40 nights in the priestly account, or 1 year if you rely on the Yahwist account. The test to find the land, and here's where the similarities become quite obvious, especially at the end of the story. They both release birds from the mountain to try to find out when it's safe. In Gilgamesh, it's a dove, it's a swallow, and then it's a raven. In the Genesis account, it's a raven and then 3 doves. They both land on tops of mountains, but different mountains. They both sacrifice after the flood, and the linguistic similarities are striking. In the Gilgamesh epic, the gods come down like flies, and they're pleased by it. But in the Noah account, Yahweh is pleased by the aroma of the sacrifice. And then they both are blessed. Gilgamesh with godlike status, Noah with a promise for peace and a promise for a future and children. So I bring that up for the same reason that we went at length talking about the Enuma Elish back before the Genesis 1 creation account, because you have a similar thing where you have these pre-existing stories of, in this case, a flood, in the case of Genesis 1, a creation account. And the people who are reading this story, and you see it's in like the 900s, 800s, 600s, and then finally, put down to the Torah compiled in the 500s. So think 800s, 900s. In the context of occupation and oppression, they take these stories that their oppressors use and they flip them on their heads. And when we read them next week, you'll see the differences and what they say about God's nature as it relates to humanity. So I'm going to bring us back for questions or comments or thoughts that occurred to you as we were going through that.
Yes, I have a comment. Be careful.
Yes.
Be careful what you say about people who are over 90 years old.
Fair enough. What I said was, if I were 90 years old and in the same physical shape as you might expect as a 90 years old, which for you is fit as a fiddle, I would want to know if living another 200 would be a constant decline, or would be that was that. But yeah, right. Fair point.
Well, in other traditions, do people live this long? I mean, they have these long-lived people in the Mesopotamian records. And
You're talking about like maybe in North and South America?
wherever there might, I mean, are there any records anywhere where people are alleged to have lived?
I don't know. And I confessedly only discovered this in my preparations for today's lesson. It's in every Bible. This one that I'm using as a kind of holding up my laptop, the New Interpreters, it tends to, if you're going to put it on a theological spectrum, it tends to be moderate to conservative. And even it had all of that about the other. A lot of what I used, the guy Freinlein I kept quoting, came from here. And so, but I'm not aware, though, outside of Mesopotamia. I only learned about the myths that were common to this area.
Nancy, how old are you talking? Like 120?
No, I'm talking like 969 or whatever.
Oh, no, I don't think there's anything like that. There are something called like blue spots or something on the earth where people live longer and live to be like 120, and it's quite normal. But no, not your 969. We're not Methuselah.
I always thought and was told that they counted differently back then. Although when you see that our years are limited to 120, then if that's the case, I mean, it's a possibility that was true. I guess I never picked up on that 120 when I was a kid, reading this.
And I do think in the New Testament, doesn't it take it down to 70 years?
I thought so too. I can't tell you where.
The Psalm chapter 10 that was mentioned briefly mentions that the span of humans is 70 years.
Yes,
yeah, okay.
It's in there somewhere.
But when I went back to my Bible class in undergrad, one theory was that people did tend to think about lineages in terms of like the patriarchs, and maybe there were whole generations in between these figures that weren't noteworthy enough to name. I really don't think that is what the original writers of this genealogy believed. I really do believe that we were meant to believe that they lived 700, 800, 900 years. And it fits the other stories we have from the area.
Also, why do they have a sacrifice? I mean, it's in the Noah story too, but when they come off the boat, there's a sacrifice.
The gods in
Yeah.
this time like sacrifices.
I mean, they just saved these few animals and then
Right.
it didn't
It's
seem very logical to me that then after they went to all this trouble,
the impulse to make God happy through actions and sacrifice is even with us today. People don't sacrifice animals, but we bargain in different ways, and we think that if we perform certain actions or show up in certain ways, I've even seen it with tithe money that we call offering. You see it in a big way in the modern prosperity gospel messaging, where it's there must be this human impulse that giving God some of the things that keeps us alive will make God happy. And you see it with last Bible lesson with Cain and Abel. We don't know why they did what they did. The ancient readers and the people who first heard those stories, it would have been part and parcel with the religious life and expressions of religious life that were in the area.
And I think too, if you go back to Adam and Eve, where God sacrificed the animals to cover their sin. I mean, the scripture doesn't say that, but that's what's implied. And if that has been picked up by Adam and Eve, then they would think that they would have, every time they would sin, they'd have to make another sacrifice, or annually, or whatever, that annual stuff and all that, the tabernacles, all that kind of stuff, that all came later. But anyway, it's just that if you go back all the way to Adam and Eve and you think about the sacrifice that God made, killing the animals to make clothing to cover the Adam and Eve, then you can weave it into the story.
That one of the things that I'm wanting to give room for in this Bible study is room to build upon a story through the centuries and find new meaning, but also an acknowledgement that it's helpful to take the story as at face value and to not to load it up with things that come later, which I think that this perfectly is expressed in what you just said, where you see the beginnings of the need for or the requirement of certain things to die as a consequence of the brokenness. And in that story, the hapless animals that are made into clothing for Adam and Eve. And what Christians have done is they will take the death of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of John, and we'll be pushing a lot of our sensibilities as we get into the Gospels, especially as we get into the Gospel of John, where it's very clearly laid out that Jesus is a Paschal lamb.
I often think of the cross as the altar cross, that Jesus was placed upon the altar cross.
Well,
instead of just the cross. It's a combination of two things, and so therefore I think of them together.
That flows straight from the Gospel of John. There are other Christologies in the Gospels that don't go there. Again, that's one of the things about our faith is there are speaks multiple voices with different looks at it. When we get to Abraham in the sacrifice, the ask for the sacrifice of his son, we'll be talking about these themes again. We can't really get into. This is a big discussion you're poking at. We read Genesis 6, starting with verse 5, and on through. I did promised restraint this week and wasn't able to follow through as we dove into chapter 5. But I really do think that we are going to not do much with the Noah's descendants bit. It's a list. It's another genealogy, and there is a short story before that about Noah getting drunk and one of the two sons seeing him naked, and this is was upsetting to Noah, and a curse is called on the son. It's an interesting story. I'm not sure how much time we should spend on it. So really focus on what comes before that, chapter 6, verse 5 through chapter 9, verse 17. All right. Thank you all. And thank you for what you each
Thank you.
bring to the group. Thank you. And take care.